Hi there, Steve Kaufman here again. I'm going off skiing for a week to Big White near Kelowna, so I probably won't be doing any more videos for a while. So I thought I would just do one here on this whole subject of language acquisition versus language learning and so forth, which seems to have generated a bit of discussion on my blog. I am a great admirer of Krashen. Igor in Macedonia says that Krashen didn't originate these theories. Whatever. I've come across them via Krashen. When I read a lot of the things that he wrote, I said, yeah, exactly, that's how I learn. But I don't accept everything that he says. And one of the things where I disagree, and it's not an important point really, but it's worth talking about, and I'll explain why. And this is this whole issue of learning a language versus acquiring a language. And he sort of, and many of the people who write about language learning try to say that there are two different approaches. One is learning, which is serious and deliberate and learning about the grammar, and the other is acquisition, which is something that we do naturally, and some people think that only children acquire their first language, whereas thereafter it's a more deliberate learning process, but they still therefore talk about a dichotomy. Krashen suggests that we continue to be, in fact, acquiring the language rather than learning it. To me, I don't like it. I don't like the use of the word acquire, because what is acquire? If I say you acquire something, it means you bought it, you took it, and it then became yours and you put it away somewhere. The word learn to me simply means that the brain is learning, and I don't like the association of learning with the classroom, with school, with teachers, with exercises, drills, tests, all of the formalized ceremonies that we seem to have attached to learning. To me, learning is as described in the book by Manfred Spitzer, which I heartily recommend. It's called Learning and the Brain, or The School for Life, or something like that. You can look it up on Amazon. Our brain learns all the time. Our brain learns by establishing patterns. It's not just the left side of the brain or the rational side of the brain. All different parts of the brain get involved. Emotion gets involved. And through a process of repetition and this whole business of neurons firing with each other and then again and creating these connections which form these patterns, so that the brain then after a while doesn't have to rediscover everything because it's got a lot of patterns in place. And this process of learning is how we learn about experience, how we learn to deal with people, how we learn to walk so we don't fall down, all the things that we learn. And as we get older, we have more and more of these patterns in place because we've come across them more often. Younger people are still discovering things and they're starting to become patterns. And so everything is learning. But learning doesn't mean that you necessarily hold on to it. It goes in, you might forget it, you might know it for a while and forget it. The brain might, I don't know, I'm not a neurologist, but from what I've read, might discard things that the brain doesn't come across too often, and yet for some strange reason the brain is capable of remembering things that you learned a long time ago and don't need anymore. So it's as I see it, it's sort of a random process whereby the brain tries to sort through all of the stimulus that it gets, puts labels on things, develops patterns, rules. This is learning. Learning is not sitting in a classroom. Learning goes on all the time. So language learning is the same, whether it's a child learning its first language or an adult. Sure, there are different circumstances. The child has no other language to interfere, because when we already have our own language, we have a tendency to go back to what is already hardwired in our brain in terms of structures, pronunciation, and so forth. The child doesn't have this interference. On the other hand, an older person learning, they have their existing vocabulary, their life experience, which helps them learn in a different way. But it's still learning, and I don't accept any distinction between acquisition and learning. To me, it's all learning. So that's one point. By the same token, this learning is a natural process. But Krashen, to my mind, and some of the ardent believers in his approach, including my good friend Igor in Macedonia, believe that it's just a matter of naturally listening and reading and you will acquire it. I don't believe that. I think that there has to be a number of other factors have to come into play, particularly when we're older. Because as the child learning his or her first language, it's just natural. They want to communicate, they hear it, there's no other language there, patterns are starting to form in the brain and whatever. But when we're older, we have to make a more deliberate effort. We have to want to learn the language, we have to try to project ourselves, we have to want to communicate with those people, all the things the child does naturally. We have to try a little harder to do. We have to not worry about sounding foolish. The child doesn't care if the child sounds childish. The child is a child. We don't want to sound childish. We don't like the feeling that we're clumsy in another language. So we have to make a greater effort to overcome these psychological barriers, first of all. And the other thing is that there are things in the language that even with the best of intention, we don't notice. And I've seen this in my own learning lots of times. So it is helpful to me to read through a grammar book. I read through it, leave through it when I start, don't intend to remember anything, but just to get a general overview of the language. And at various times I keep a book around my toilet. When I sit there on the can, if you pardon me, leaf through it, and occasionally you pick some stuff up, but not with the intention of learning it so that you can pass a test on it. All the exercises and quizzes that they have in those books, I ignore them. I just quickly skim over what they have to say about how the language works, most of which I forget, couldn't possibly remember it, doesn't really make sense. And yet, by the 5th or 6th or 7th time when I read it after a year or two into the language, in fact, I'll notice things, even in terms of, even though I've read this thing 3 times before, I never noticed what they were saying. And then all of a sudden I'll notice it. So, and that then helps me to notice it when I'm listening or reading in the language. And similarly, these various word lists that we go through, and ideally word lists that come from our listening and reading, reviewing them in different ways. I like to review words before and after I read the text, and of course Link enables us to do that very easily. I like to occasionally go to my vocabulary section at Link and look words up by suffix, by prefix, alphabetical, just different things like that that help me notice things on a random basis. There is no question in my mind that a variety of these activities, and some people swear by their Anki and their spaced repetition and all these different things, help us to notice. I still believe that the bulk of our time has to be spent on exposing us to the language, but to pretend that it's just a matter of listening and reading, I don't buy it. I think that's the most important thing to do. We needn't worry about what we can't remember. We needn't try and save it for a test. We shouldn't test kids on language in school. But we should, as learners, and if we have students, encourage them to do things that help them notice. So there I also disagree with Krashen. And the third thing, and I also don't agree with him about the idea that immigrant children should first learn in their own language before learning English. I mean, there's lots of Hispanic kids, so they might get away with doing it. You're going to do that for everybody? It doesn't make sense. To me, it makes much more sense. Kids move to the United States, get with the program, learn English, be as fluent as you possibly can be in English, and then worry about your Spanish when you have time. The other thing is, there are people who still don't believe that a lot of listening and reading is better than grammar learning. It is. The brain learns. I came across I was skiing, I came across this Russian family. We spoke for a while in Russian. I mean, my Russian was much better than the parents' English. They've been in Canada for 8 years. There's no question in my mind that if those parents had done what I'd done, spent the amount of time that I've spent just listening and reading and occasionally flipping through a grammar book, they would be further ahead, and if they had the determination to do it. So it works. Maybe I'm better at it because I've had 10 languages, 9 languages, whatever, but they would be better off if they did what I did. I'm quite convinced. Nothing wrong with the ESL school. They go there and they make friends with people from other countries, and it helps them feel more comfortable in Canada. But in terms of language learning, if they were on a program like I was on, they would be miles ahead. That's how they would learn. And so they would learn, and nothing against the term, but I don't like this idea of a dichotomy between acquisition and learning. You don't learn in school. You learn because the brain learns.